Chapter 4. Bram-Hell. The long-distance call came during breakfast. Down a crackling telephone line, the distraught headmaster of Pangbourne, Luke's boarding school, told my mother that Luke had defected again. This time, my brother was caught in his pyjamas, scrambling across the roof of the old school. Hardly the great escape. It was just 3 days before Mark and Sarah's wedding. The young couple, my parents, Grandy, and I were all enjoying pre-festivity relaxation at the lake, where Sarah's parents had their cottage just outside Kingston, Ontario. My mother and father had reconciled again for the wedding, but the harmony between them was like my mother's sanity, precarious. And in her presence I never breathed properly. I had to be vigilant, constantly aware of the early glint of hatred, the twitch in her cheek, the hard set of her jawline, the frenetic body movements, all signs of an impending explosion. And now here it was. "You deal with him." Anguished, my mother thrust the phone at me. "He'll talk to you." She, the outsider of the mutually protective bond between Luke and me, I, the accused. Somehow it was all my fault again. She ran outside then, punching her fists into the air, shouting her rage, renting the peaceful fabric of the lake scenery with her gut-wrenching sobs. Sarah looked up from her coffee cup, stunned. "Welcome to the family, Sarah. So what do you think of us so far?" Somehow my mother instantly turned Luke's defection into being all about her failures. If I had dared to speak, I could have told her that this was Luke's revenge on his father for not paying for him to come to Canada and Mark's wedding. But I kept quiet. The last thing she wanted right now was my opinion, and the last thing I wanted was to be shredded. If I could have paid for my younger brother to join us, I would have gladly, but I had only just scrambled enough together for myself. My heart was torn in two as, at the other end of the line, so far away, 15-year-old Luke sounded like the frightened 3-year-old I used to comfort. But I had no means of solace now, except to listen to his hurt, anger, and frustration. "I hate it here," he sobbed. "I hate it here." "I know, Luke," I said. "I know." But I didn't really. 10 days later we were back home, or that's what we called the flat in Bram-Hell. Luke had been conveniently filed away into yet another boarding school out of harm's way, or so my parents claimed. God knows what had possessed my father to move my mother and him from our family home, a large, light 4-bedroomed house, albeit full of good, not so good, and latterly nasty memories, to this tiny square box of a 2-bedroom flat. Yes, it was on a serenely peaceful residential street, but the dense, tall evergreens that overshadowed the windows only accentuated the sense of incarceration. As far as I could tell, his thinking was that if they were going to reconcile, my mother needed a fresh start. New memories, and the flat would only be for midweek, he told her, when he was working, and not so much housework, not that she did any. Then they could enjoy weekends at the cottage in Wales. Well, that's what he said. Didn't he know that my mother abhorred the cottage even more than the flat? Probably something to do with Barbara Stevens, that damn bitch who had enjoyed illicit weekends there with my father, sitting on their furniture, eating off their china, sleeping in their bed. Maybe it was my father's sanity I should have been more concerned about. Did he just make arbitrary decisions about what was best for Sylvia? Or did he consult with her and she gave him her martyred response? "Whatever you want, Charles. Don't worry about me." But she would make him pay for it later. Oh, yes. My parents had grudgingly agreed that I could stay with them while I scraped together enough money for my next trip, hitchhiking around Europe with Erica and Hilary. To live at home for a month seemed like a good idea at the time, or at least the most practical. But when I think back now, it would have been less painful to sleep under a bridge, on a bed of nails, and eat worms than to witness what I did. I was toying with emotional masochism and don't know why I did it. Maybe I believed it was my only option, or that I could somehow save my parents from each other, for a while anyway. "You're not going. It's too dangerous," my mother intoned when I talked of my impending venture. I knew that her parental concern was a cloak for her hatred of me and my freedom, but I wasn't going to let either her paranoid fears or her jealousy stop me. Misery loves company, I thought, and her protestations only strengthened my resolve to escape this flat, the grey pettiness of the North, and her schizophrenic outbursts. Not that I didn't have some of my own fears. She was right, of course. We could be raped and murdered, but I didn't want to think about that. I focused on the adventure, seeing all those different countries, the history, the languages, and happy, normal people. A week later, Erica, my only pipeline to the real world and sanity, rang. "We're leaving on the 25th of July, 2 weeks earlier than we planned," she announced. How would I get enough money together in time? "Can you still come?" she asked. "Yes," I told her quickly. I would have to work in dark and dingy Dickensian offices, typing and filing, treated as the alien outsider, but I would somehow make enough money for the trip. "Are you courting?" the black-haired secretary asked. She was probably only 45-ish, but like many northern women, old before their time, she already walked with the rounded, stooped shoulders. "No," I responded, as I sorted the yellow NCR forms into alphabetical order. How I hated the red-bricked, dark and musty-smelling offices of Stockport, and the monotony of filing. "All for a good cause, though," I told myself. "Oh dear," she groaned, as if suddenly understanding that I had been condemned to some awful death. "How old are you?" There was a tragic tone to her voice. "None of your business," I wanted to say. 19? "Ooh." She stepped back from me. In her eyes I was condemned to the eternally barren hell of spinsterhood. My head was on the chopping block now. I could say goodbye to any hope of happiness. "Do you want to get married then?" A last-ditch attempt to save my life. I groaned inwardly. If one wasn't pregnant and married by 18, normally in that order, there was "no hope for you. Get me out of here." "Yes, but not yet." "I'm only 19, for God's sake. What's the big deal about marriage anyway? People live together for 30 years, share their whole lives, bring children into the world, endure all the hardships, and then turn around and tear each other to shreds. What exactly is the point?" The woman returned to her desk. I was a hopeless cause. I didn't care. I hated the North. I hated this job, and my mother was getting crazier and crazier. Finally, there was talk of Mother's going to see a psychiatrist. Thank God. Now, maybe there was hope. I would have suggested it myself a long time ago, but I knew the response I would get. "Who the hell do you think you are, you little bitch?" she would have shouted. "You think you know everything, don't you?" And I would have shrugged helplessly. There was no defense against my mother's attacks. I remember coming home that Tuesday, full of hope. As I reached the front door, I tried to shake off the grey dreariness of the wet, misty fog that had enveloped the whole day. But when I entered the flat, the greyness had leached in through the walls. There were no lights on, even though it was dark inside the flat. "Hello?" I called out. "Anybody home?" I heard a whimper from the living room. Uh-oh, my stomach lurched. One day I anticipated coming home to find my mother sprawled on the kitchen floor, finally having stuck her head in the oven and gassed herself to death, as she often threatened to do. Well, today at least she was alive. It took me an eternity to move along the darkened, straight, short hallway towards the living room. What would I find? Already I wanted to cry. There was my mother sitting in the sombre shadows in the middle of the 3-seater settee, nursing a full glass of sherry, staring hard at the blanket of dark green branches just outside our window. She was weeping quietly, eerily, as if the tears themselves were cutting into her cheeks with her pain. I sank down onto the chair facing her, needing the strength for what was to come. "What happened?" I finally asked. A barely perceptible shiver, like a mild electric shock, passed through her body. Did you see the psychiatrist?" "Oh!" She waved her hand in the air, as if to push the reminder of him away, or me and my questions. I waited. I didn't like the look of terrible hurt in her eyes. Already I wanted to kill the psychiatrist. What had he done to her? She'd had to drive all the way up to Liverpool, a distance of at least 100 miles round trip, on this horrible dreary day. And for what? "Do you want a cup of tea?" She barely shook her head in response, still refusing to speak, but clutching her glass of sherry as if it was the only solid thing in her world. How many had she had? I got up, put down my jacket on the chair, and moved to the kitchen. I needed something hot, liquid, comforting. I returned to the living room and resumed my position on the edge of my chair, legs crossed, waiting. Tears of hurt and rage still poured down her cheeks, spilling out like a geyser from some deep bottomless pit of despair, as if everything good that she had ever known had all just been stripped away. I had never seen this much grief. What should I do? Stay away? Let her be? Or just sit here until she was ready to talk? Her whole body was stiff, frozen to the middle of that settee, holding herself intact, afraid that if she moved she might fall apart. I would have offered to make her something to eat, but I knew that it was futile. Her diet, since our return from Canada, consisted of large bars of Cadbury's fruit and nut chocolate, and copious glasses of sherry, and she was already so skinny. I wasn't sure that she was even eating the chocolate. She stuffed the purple wrap bars down behind her in the settee cushion. Every now and then I would hear a rustling of foil and a snap as she broke off another piece. It was a protective habit from when we were all at home, hiding her treats from our gluttonous eyes. "What did he say?" I ventured. Maybe I should just shut up. At first she didn't move, and then she suddenly swiveled her head around at me, wild eyes fixed on mine, flashing hatred, insanity, grief. "What did he say?" she snarled, like a wild cat, spittle flying from her mouth. "I'll tell you what he said." But then the rage that I braced myself against disintegrated into grief again, and she sobbed. I wanted to move over to her, take her hand, comfort her, but my mother didn't invite comfort. I wished I could at least turn on a light instead of sitting here in the dark shadows. Instead, I sat melded to my chair. Oh God, oh God, oh God, where was everybody? My family, my father. He would be home from work soon, but would that make it better or worse? Sometimes the sight of him only seemed to ignite the fires of hatred within her. "He told me," she hissed, "that I should—" "Oh!" She shook her head in disgust. Pull myself together." The last 3 words trailed off into another fit of sobbing. If only it were that easy. She turned her head quickly towards the window, as if repelling some revolting slime. Even in the descending darkness I could see swollen eyes, her cheeks wet and red from rage and sherry. Yes, I definitely wanted to kill this psychiatrist. Too bad he lived all the hell way up in Liverpool. That was it? Oh, no. Uh-oh. He said. More tears flowed down her florid cheeks, sarcastic indignation in her voice. He said I should be thankful. She spat the last word out. Thankful. What for? Even I couldn't follow this line of thinking. Ugh, she half-snorted, an ugly sneer contorting her features, that I had a good figure for my age. I had always suspected that psychiatrists had to be a little batty to work with insane people, but I wondered if this man was on the wrong side of the bars. Suddenly I needed life in this suffocating box of a flat. I was drowning in her misery. Light, people, sound. "Do you mind if I switch on a light?" I asked tentatively, even though I was afraid to see her grief in full technicolor. She waved her hand. Nothing mattered any more. There was a click at the front door. My father was home. What would it be tonight? Screaming, yelling, slapping of faces with indifference to my presence, or whispered conciliatory discussions, overly concerned that they talk out of my prying earshot? As if every one of my happy childhood memories hadn't already been dismembered, my mother not bothering to keep the dirty laundry of family secrets hidden anymore, I would never be able to trust again, not my own judgment or myself, because I would never know what was real. Nothing was as it seemed. I didn't blame my parents for lying to us about their less-than-perfect pasts. They had done it to protect us. I blame myself for being stupid, for not seeing. That night, as I concocted a dinner from leftover vegetables and tinned goods, I watched, through the kitchen door, my father's back, as he sat on the settee, leaning over her, making commiserating noises while she sobbed and ranted. I don't think he understood her pain. I could only guess at it, and that's why I felt so helpless. For the next 3 days, my mother stayed in that position, on the settee, as if nailed to those cushions, a bottle of sherry at her feet, her heart and my heart breaking. If she could, I thought, she would cry herself to death.